Hello friends, I am Nisha Sharma, Associate Professor, Department of English. The topic under discussion today is a critical appreciation of John Milton's poem on his blindness. John Milton is known as one of the greatest and most influential English poets, ranking with Chaucer and Shakespeare. He wrote both poetry and prose, and in poetry wrote pastoral, elegy, epic, drama, sonnet, and other kinds. His most famous and influential work is the epic Paradise Lost, which has been at the center of English literary criticism since Milton's day. His sonnets have received less critical attention. Lord Macaulay, unusual in valuing the sonnets highly, wrote in critical, historical, and miscellaneous essays that traces of the peculiar character of Milton may be found in all his works, but it is most strongly displayed in the sonnets. When I consider how my light is spent, also known as On His Blindness, is one of the best known of the sonnets of John Milton. The last three lines are particularly well known. They conclude with, They also serve who only stand and wait, which is much quoted, though rarely in context. Variants of it have been used as mottos in a number of contexts. For example, the Dickin Medal for Service Animals bears the motto, We also serve. And Navy Wives Clubs of America uses the motto, They also serve who stay and wait. The sonnet was first published in Milton's 1673 poems in his autograph notebook, known as the Trinity Manuscript, from its location in the Wren Library of Trinity College, Cambridge. He gave it the number 19, but in the published book it was numbered 16, so both numbers are used for it. It is popularly given the title On His Blindness, but there is no evidence that Milton used this title. It was assigned a century later by Thomas Newton in his 1761 edition of Milton's poetry, as was commonly done at the time by editors of posthumous collections. Milton struggles in this sonnet with frustration at becoming blind and with his own sense of how important it is to use one's talent well in God's service. The sonnet records how he comes to understand a higher notion of service. Real service is doing the will of God, even if it means he must stand and wait. Notice as well the use of quite puns or words that draw on double meanings. The words with double meanings are spent in line 1, telling secondary meaning point, line 3, useless secondary meaning without usury or interest on a debt, line 4, account, line 6, and exact, line 7. The secondary meanings run in a coherent line of images. All are images of monetary exchange. Milton is a poet who is highly sensitive to the multiple senses available in language and to clusters of imagery of this sort. Another thing to understand about Milton's sonnets is their topical range. Not a writer of love sonnets in English, although the sonnets he wrote in Italian are love sonnets. Milton writes political sonnets, occasional sonnets, elegiac sonnets, and sonnets of personal meditation like this one, or his another sonnet on his 23rd birthday. Now, the summary of the poem. The poem is about the poet himself. He became blind at an early age, which he calls as half of his life. Due to blindness, the whole world is dark and gloomy. The gift of being a creative writer and poet, which has been accorded to him by the God, is now useless for him. though the gift or skill given to him by God would remain with him till death, but he will not be able to use it. As God has taken away his eyesight, he has become more submissive and wants to serve God with his poetic power. He was greatly inclined to write poetry in praise of God and present to him a true account of his writings. He wants to do this so that God may not snub him after his death. He mildly wants to ask God that how can we require to do work equal to any normal person in spite of his total blindness. In the answer to this heartfelt feeling of the poet, his conscience comes to his rescue to tell that he must keep patience and God does not want anything from man. God's kingdom is very rich and splendid. Thousands of angels are every time ready to act on God's command. They carry out God's wishes on land and sea without rest. The mortals on earth cannot serve God at this speed, so they must wait in silence for His mercy. Milton says that those who are not able to serve God should simply stand in service of God and wait for their chance to receive mercy of God. Now, analysis. On His Blindness is one of the finest sonnets in English poetry. It is an autobiographical sonnet and brings before us the personality and character of the blind poet John Milton. Milton became blind in 1652 when he was 44 years of age. Milton's life was full of gloom and despair, and he was overcome by sadness and grief. At this time, his learning of religious and biblical literature came to his rescue. His faith in God and religion comes forth in this sonnet. His strong faith in God and belief in the benign benignity come to help him. The God always shows mercy on everyone. This philosophy is very near to Indian philosophy of the Veds and Bhagavad, which teaches man to do his duty towards God and society and have faith in the deeds of God. Everything done by God is essential and is being done for ultimate good of mankind. Milton is also conscious about his life after death. In spite of being blind, he wants to make use of his poetic power. So, thus after death, when he is presented before God, the God may not reproach him. When his inner self tries to make a complaint against God as to how he could be able to do full work when he is blind, he is shown the right path by patience. Patience is being personified in the poem. Patience tells him that God would not make query about his work, as God has thousands of very efficient angels who work to carry out commands of God all the time over land and sea without taking rest. Patience advises that a man should accept all the pleasures and pain afflicted by God, and in spite of being in pain, one should not complain and bear them in a spirit of calmness. The last line of the sonnet explains the purpose of the poet. One should have devotion and faith in God and work with all his capacity and wait patiently for mercy of God. There are the true devotees of God who do not complain and silently wait for their turn to have mercy of God. Theme. The supremacy of God and complete faith in God is the basic theme of this sonnet. This is one of the noblest poems in English language. This autobiographical poem raises the complaint of an aggrieved person against God and then gives the solution also. It is a complete poem in this sense. It raises a genuine complaint and provided the solution for accepting the afflictions of God with calmness and faith. These two are the qualities which one must have towards the Maker. The sonnet tells us that faith and confidence in God should not be shaken in any way, as only such persons are loved by God and are amply rewarded. We find that this has been proven in the life of Milton as well. His major and legendary compositions were written by him when he was blind. Milton will always be remembered and praised for Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Simpson agonized the masterpieces which he wrote when he was blind. Limitation. In Sonnet 16, Milton meditates on the devastating effect blindness has had on his life and work. He equates his lost vision with light spent and laments not the handicap in and of itself, but the limitations it imposes on his work as a poet. His poetic ability is so important to him that he calls it that one talent, suggesting it is the only talent that matters. It is lost with me useless. In other words, its expression has been rendered impossible by his blindness. His limitation is particularly distressing since Milton desires more than ever to write poetry but seems to see no way to continue. Blindness imposed a double limitation on Milton's poetic activity. In the broadest sense, it made poetry an impossible activity, for there was no way for a blind man to put words to paper. In addition, Milton's conception of epic poetry presupposed a high level of education. The loss of his vision meant he could no longer read and by extension could no longer learn. Next is light. The image of light is important to the poem. On the most superficial level, it refers to physical light, which the poet can no longer experience. It calls to mind a story in Gospel of John to which Milton referred in other texts. In the story, Jesus miraculously cures a beggar's blindness. The image of light resonates on many different levels in the Bible story, and most are present in Sonnet 16 as well. For instance, when Jesus tells his disciple, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. Daylight is a metaphor for man's life. Like each day, our lives are limited, and once night comes, that day is gone forever. As he writes, Milton is still alive, but he believes that darkness, his blindness has brought, means the end of his creative life. When he writes of talent which is death to height, he suggests further that his blindness will prevent him from achieving another longer life, the immortality that fame brings a poet who has written a masterpiece. On yet another level, light signifies the inner light, the spiritual light that shines in the world. In the gospel story, Christ called himself the light of the world, that he was bringing God's word to men. Milton believed that poets were also bringers of light. Their works brought a special kind of enlightenment to humanity, but his blindness has snuffed out his poetic light. Next is duty. Milton refers to another gospel passage in this sonnet, the parable of the talents from the Gospel of Matthew. In that story, a master gives each of his three servants a sum of money, that is, some talents, which they are able to keep for him while he undertakes a journey. When he returns, he asks each servant for the money. The first two have used the money wisely and returned to the master twice the sum they were entrusted with. The third servant, however, only buried his talent. The master is angry with the servant, takes back the money, and casts him in the outer darkness. The moral of the story, of which Milton is well aware, is that each are given gifts by God, and that for all there will be a day of reckoning when all will have to present true account. In this poem, Milton plays upon the two meanings of talent, a form of money in the Bible story and a God given ability in the everyday sense. He fears that because of his blindness, he will never be able to put his talent to the use God intends. For 14 years, Milton hid his talent in the earth, in the words of the gospel. The wicked and slothful servant was cast into darkness. One sense, therefore, in which it is death to hide one's talent is that one will be punished, cast out of the light, out of God's presence. Milton, however, has not yet been called to make his true account. His soul burns as much as ever to put it to use. But the darkness into which he has already been cast prevents Milton from doing his duty to God and making full use of his talent. Can God expect him to do his work without his eyesight? He is finally tempted to ask. Can God truly expect him to fulfill a duty that God Himself has apparently made impossible? Next theme is submission. Patience, the virtue, counsels against putting that foolish question put to the Almighty. Man's duty to God is not to give him anything. God has no need of humans' work. Everything they have are His own gifts, anyway, in Milton's eyes. In the face of a catastrophe like blindness, the only course of action open to him is, and the rest of the mankind, as the last six lines suggest, is humble resignation to God's will. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. Harkens back to the passage in John's Gospel mentioned earlier. Jesus tells his disciples that the blind man did not become blind because he had sinned, but that the work of God should be made manifest in him. Like Job, Milton accepts his lot in life as part of a greater plan. Some are meant for action to speak and post over the land and ocean without end, but others who only stand and wait. Whether as a servant awaiting his master's bidding or a laborer waiting to be hired, do God's will. Style. Milton is the supreme master of grand style. We find glimpses of this in the present sonnet as well. The language used is learned and remote from familiar associations. It is a mixture of Latinism and archaism with a small sparkling of Italian phraseology. His sonnet is highly allusive and bookish and has the stamp of a mind not only replete with a wide, various, and even obscure learning. The sonnet is a continuous reverberation of echoes and suggestion. Its effect is produced not by means of what it expresses, but what it suggests. Milton adopted Petrarchan style in writing the sonnet. He brought back the sonnet to its original and strict type, the type which Petrarch had fixed. The first 8 lines are called octave, while the 6 lines are sestet. The octave poses a problem, and the sestet or last 6 lines offers an answer or resolution. The dividing point between problem and solution is at line 9, usually called the turn or volta. In this sonnet, Milton uses the turn cleverly to emphasize his own impatience. His octave has run into the sestet. The quatrains use enclosed rhyme ABBA, ABBA. Here the sestet's rhyme scheme is CD, CD. On his blindness as an autobiographical song. Milton's blindness was not an unexpected bolt from the blue. His mother had bad vision, and his own eyesight faded slowly over nearly a decade. Trouble seemed to start in 1644 when he noticed problems reading. He once described his early symptoms as a sort of rainbow that obscured whatever he was looking at. That was followed by a mist in his left eye, which gradually blotted out everything on that side. Objects nearby looked smaller than they should have. When he rested and closed his eyes, he experienced an explosion of colors. This description has suggested to medical specialists that he had a cyst on his pituitary gland. In 1650, his left eye became completely blind. Milton's continuous writing, reading, and correction of proofs probably hastened his complete loss of vision. For the last 22 years of his life, he had to dictate his writings to a secretary. A more difficult adjustment for the studious Milton may have been that he needed someone to read to him. Milton became completely blind at the age of 43 in 1652, and Sonnet 16 is intimately connected with the poet's loss of sight. But scholars disagree whether Milton composed the piece upon the onset of total blindness or at another date. Some critics, for example, insist that the sonnets were written in chronological order. If so, Sonnet 16 would have been written sometime after 1655. Thank you.